A few months ago, Oak called and he said, "We need to get you on tape while you're still with us." And I got to pondering that, and I wondered what he knew that I didn't know. But after you pass your 80th birthday, you see things a little bit different than you did when you were 20. And so certain sort of marks keep coming as we go through the various cycles of our lives, as you well know. At my age, you stop reading the funny papers and you start reading the obituaries. You quit worrying so much about acid rock and worry a little bit more about acid reflux. And you're all going to have this great experience. Just hang in there. A few years ago, my wife and I had the opportunity of serving a mission in Nauvoo, Illinois. And when we met with our mission president in the introductory interview, he sort of got acquainted a little bit with us, and he said, "Well, I think you're going to fit in just fine out here. We have a marvelous group that live in this little city. It's a historical site for the state of Illinois, and many of you have been there, and so you know what transpires. And it's manned by senior citizen couples and some younger, more talented, flexible individuals that come there to serve." But he said, "You're here. We all have gray hair, white hair, or no hair, and we're all on drugs." And we knew that was true, especially after we got acquainted with the rest of the people. As I thought about this conference and something that I might say, looking back over my life, what is it that's happened that might be useful to the issues that you're confronting now? And basically, I boiled down the relevance ladder to three things, probably. I asked myself, what basic projects have I researched and written about? Second, what personal observations on American education should I make to this audience? And third, could I reduce some of the evidence to a PowerPoint presentation that could be used to trigger discussions about current educational issues? And I want to begin by making a comment regarding notes. You don't have to take any notes about what I'm saying. Only take notes on what you think about while you listen to what I'm saying. Because that's the most important thing that's happening. Not what I'm saying, but what you think about while I'm saying it. And all of the information that I'll be moving over in the next 30 minutes or so, you either have in a handout form, or if you go to the ABE site under resources, you click on your little gadgets, and there's a lot of information there. I could summarize three of the things for that one point. Oak mentioned that I wrote Teach the Children, and the reason I wrote it was because at the end of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century, the great educational debate in our society had to do with reason and revelation. That was the battleground. And those who pushed that debate from a secular, progressive, quote, quote, point of view won the battle. And they took over academia and higher education in America. They actually occupied the buildings that were built by donated monies and efforts of real believers It was a part of our early history. For 150 years, education kind of went like this in America. From what it was to something better, 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 until you hit this period between 1880 and 1920. And then that debate took place, and the outcome has been, and right now, education in America is in turmoil. As late as this week, if any of you happen to watch the CNN documentary related to education, and if you haven't, if there's a way for you to get access to it, it would be well worth your time to listen to them talk about enough specifics related to education that there's just all kinds of things going. I mean, we got schools out in the middle of Death Valley where they're trying to isolate just male students. And they went through what that educational experience was trying to be. They got a school that had no requirements for the students to pay tuition in New York City that was started by a very wealthy man decades and decades ago, and now it's in such debt-wise that they're wondering if they can salvage it, and they did this year have to begin charging some kind of tuition to go to that school. And they talked about the party school down in Arizona that's #1 in Arizona State, and showed what the kids were doing there and how many of the wealthy came and never went to class, but they had beer busts and all that goes on in that direction. And then they talked about other things that were more favorable, but there's a hodgepodge amidst all of this unrest about American education, and getting a handle on how that came to be and how it can be utilized by us as we try to cope with contemporary circumstances, I think is part of what's the purpose behind meeting here today. So that's the direction that I want to go, and that's the reason I wrote Teach the Children. It was obvious teaching at BYU that we were an anomaly in the world. When you are in education, you have to get involved in the academic organizations, and so I went into the philosophy of education and eventually became president of an organization called the Far Western Philosophy of Education Society. And we gave papers in numerous and lots of campuses across the country. And listening to those people argue and get off in the weeds pretty deep, and even using the 50-cent words that are up here when you say the anatomy, that could turn people off right there if they ever had an anatomy class, because it gets so technical. But anyway, it was obvious that what we lost in the big shift that I talked about was we lost the moral context for education in America. It became obsolete. And so I wrote a little syllabus that we used at BYU for a while called Creating a Moral School. And you can read this back on that same spot. If you go to resources on the ABE and pull it down, it's all there. And you're welcome to it and whatever it might say that would be of interest. But there's a case made for how people in clusters in the right communities can band together and they can have a school that still has a moral context to it on the basis of what's constitutionally still valid. And I know there's a lot of things that are falling apart and efforts being made to preserve and protect. We've got what's going on in the Vatican this past week or so. That's some way of trying to salvage the family, which is very quickly being eroded to represent nothing like what it has been and what it needs to be in order to have students who can come through any kind of educational enterprise and come out at the end better off. So that was the second one. The third one that I've finished, and this will be my last. I got interested while we were in Nauvoo in the fact that no one had ever written anything about Joseph Smith. related to education, yet he spent his whole life, brief as it was, as an educator. And so I tried to go through and present what he laid out, which in effect is the foundations of an educational program that will lead us into a millennial society. And so for whatever those might be worth, and there are some copies, as he indicated, on Amazon. The ones that have got new ones are asking $200 and $300 and $400 for them, and I'm saying, where were they when I was trying to sell this book? But the second thing I want to talk about with you, besides these projects that reach back 3 or 4 decades, because that's when I was involved in the circles. In the handouts you have, there's a list called 10 Observations about American Education. If you want to pull that out and look at it, I want to read these a little bit, and then I want to use some of these slides on the PowerPoint that will allow us to dig into some of the evidence a little bit. And I'll try to leave some time here so we can have a little question and answer or discussion at the end here, but I'm just going to read the first 5, and these are general kinds of comments that I would make about education now. And then the second 5, that set, has to do more with specifics. And we'll talk a little bit and use some of these slides, not all of them, but some of them. And I've asked Oak if he would make even this color slide presentation. He can put that also on the homepage for ABE, and you can download it and use them if you want to use them. You're welcome to do that. Number 1, every society is created and sustained or destroyed by education. Now you could have a conference on that. And it runs deep, and it's very significant. And it needs to be part of our preparation to defend what we want to defend and to pursue what we would like to create in education. That principle has validity to it, and it's defensible, academically or otherwise. Number 2, there are 3 distinct contexts in which schooling occurs: spiritual, moral, and secular. The spiritual may involve ordinances, and that's why we've had separation of church and state. Issues evolve in American education. The moral context involves or envelops intent and action. But that's what the founding fathers built as a foundation for education in America. And their writings are full of that. And then there's the secular context, which is the ruling philosophical set of premises that govern public schooling presently. And that was the result of that battle that I talked about between 1880 and 1920, when the big shift came in our society. That's influenced all of our basic institutions and is now seriously trying to get rid of the family as a traditional institution. Number 3, 3,000 years of schooling history attests to this fact that the family is the center of moral education. More than this, it is the home that is obedient to its God or gods, and families can be helped or hindered by the forms of schooling that surround them. Anybody that takes a serious look at things would find that. Number 4, American culture changed its intellectual foundations from the sacred to the secular in this period that I spoke of, 1880 to 1920. And that's when academia embraced the secular hypothesis, which said in street language is, the more we learn about the secular, the less need there is for the spiritual. That's the motto of modern education. This shift altered our civil society and public education. The legal and the social order changed significantly, and we're still moving through those toward more and more radical states. Number 5, backed by evolving legal support, American public schools are now essentially secular, not moral, not spiritual. Traditional moral imperatives have been replaced by relative values and policies. Precepts of men have replaced the precepts of God, and America's public schooling is now hostage to quite a wide variety of secular ideologies. Now, the second set, the specific ones. Number 6 would be administrative agendas in the public schools are dominated by direct or indirect budgetary line items. If you go to a meeting, a board meeting, if you go to a meeting with the faculty and you have an agenda and you just look at it, it's going to be primarily a matter of budgetary line items, not non-budgetary line items. But non-budgetary line items are more significant to successful education than budgetary line items are. And the more we feel comfortable discussing that and articulating it, the more likely we'll have some influence when we're trying to deal with local circumstances. And number 7, philosophically, you're going to hear 2 words today, and I'm going to try to make them clear enough before I get finished. Custodialism and factionalism now drive the primary controlling influences in public education. Various unions, teacher unions, administrative unions, school board unions or associations, and accreditation associations are major forces that shape this infrastructure of contemporary public schooling. Number 8, there are 4 elements of education. When you try to get your arms around it, you can reduce it down to 4 umbrellas: context, content, process, and structure. Context is the big picture and the why, wherefore we're going about it and why send Johnny and Mary to school anyway. Content is what we're going to teach. Process is the method we're going to use. And structure is when you do what, at what level, and then the developmental elements of education come to bear. Educational context, and this is what's significant about this observation, is now a toxic topic. Any educational meeting in the public sector that I've been in the last few years, context has never been an issue. It's always in the weeds of content, process, and structure. And if we stay there, we're going to continually be in a bubbling environment until you back off and get people to think about context. You never know really where they're going to go and what they're going to try to drive toward. When context is ignored, number 9, or changed, ends become means and become confused. In public education, means have become ends. Former ends are now blurred, lost, or deemed irrelevant. For example, focusing on teaching a child to read in order that, is the way it used to be, I want her to learn how to read because, is different than just teaching a child to read and then giving a test to see if she can. Because they threw off that whole moral enveloping purpose of education when that big battle was fought at the turn of the century. And finally, American schooling began and developed as a Judeo-Christian moral enterprise. It was constitutionally valid, still is from that perspective. Moral schooling is important because where there is no true morality, there can be no true spirituality. And those who might be familiar with the Latter-day Saint theology know that's where you go from telestial to terrestrial. And that's a reality there. There will only be a variety of counterfeits. So with that in mind, I want to look at some of these slides. And that bottom statement here, what we think with when we think about something makes all the difference. I am convinced at this point in my life that people living today can learn more about true education by studying the life and teachings of Joseph Smith than they can by studying all the books on education they might find in any library available to them. Now that's a pretty bold statement. But I think as we go through here, I'll have a couple of little places that will make that ring true to you, especially if you've ever heard of Common Core. And this is why, basically, that first statement can stand. Joseph Smith articulated a pattern of religious and educational order, beliefs, principles, and ordinances against which all other religious and educational orders, beliefs, principles, and ordinances can be evaluated. And that's a mouthful. The most critical element in the study of education, I'm going to go fast because I want to quit and let you talk. The most critical element in the study of education is context. It is context that defines what and who we are, where we came from, what our destiny can be. And you know that was central in the early history of this nation, and it's totally or mostly absent now in our public sector. Where context is corrupt or uncertain, confusion will prevail, and that's true at home, at work, at play, or in education. There's 4 paths to understanding it, and I talked a little bit about that. Early American education had a moral content. It involved the Judeo-Christian notion of values, such as the 10 Commandments, biblical proverbs, Sermon on the Mount. In fact, that's what the book of Proverbs is in the Old Testament. That was a teacher's manual for the parents when they were trying to school their children in antiquity. Modern American education adopted, when they rejected the moral fabric, they adopted an ethical context, limited to precepts of men. We call it social relativism or a bunch of other names. But it's built on these 3 premises: what the culture accepts, or what the group wants, or what the individual desires, and there's approaches and philosophies that flow out of all 3 of those, and lots of books written, depending on what the author used as the jumping off place or the platform. Public professional education literature today essentially ignores context. It's academically and politically toxic. The more you talk about that, the more people get all upset. Research and policy focus is on content, process, and structure, and that immediately puts you in the weeds. And this is critical because, as we'll see at the conclusion of my comments here, context influences dramatically and often determines content, process, and structure. So getting that to think with when you think about any educational issue is very important. Well, I mentioned that I went around and hobnobbed with a lot of these people. Those were some of the universities where we held conferences and I delivered papers. U of C, USC, Berkeley, Caltech, San Diego, Santa Cruz, Mexicali, Fordham, Duke, Arizona, Arizona State, BYU, and some others. Anyway, that's a lot of stuff. Talked about talked about in strange language. But that's where I learned what you think with makes all the difference. And so let's go through. You can see these and you can have discussions about it, but there's some other things that are more critical for us today. Here's an example of applied doctrines, and I skipped all the doctrinal foundation there, but 2 approaches to education that show conflicting patterns of authority and control. Joseph Smith said, and just think about this because he wasn't the only one that thought this in his day. Joseph Smith felt that education was an individual function, a family obligation, a church responsibility, and a state interest, in that order, in that hierarchy. And if you read his teachings about learning and teaching and how to go about it, it follows that pattern. If you look at Common Core and what they're trying to do, they've scrambled them. And it's not just what's happened with Bill Gates and his project, but it's now conceived as a state or government-controlled function. It's a local obligation financed by taxation. And so you got to pay your taxes, and you know most of them go that way and towards education. It's an administrator-teacher responsibility, an individual or family interest, hopefully, and it's a great teacher union concern. Let's discuss just for a moment or so this idea of custodialism and see if we can get a feeling about it. If you Google custodialism and start reading some of the things, you'll find out it surfaced mid-century in the last 100 years about in the mental health area. And if you just put Neil Flinders and custodialism, there'll be a paper I presented in there. Oak says he'll put that on the resources thing. But that was 1982, and they were having this big debate about custodial philosophy in the mental health, whether the patient was supposed to have anything to say about the treatment and where he was going to be treated, or his family or her family, and whether the staff and the doctors providing the instruction and the treatment, how was that supposed to happen? And so with the forces of humanism in the 1960s and 70s surfacing, they kind of threw off the old idea that we just warehouse people with mental health problems, which was the pattern. Put them in an institution and hide them away. And they said, no, there ought to be some agency involved there, and you can read about that. But there were a few articles about how that also drifted right over into education. And I want to show you a little bit about how that happened. And so the question in my mind is custodialism, or was then 30 years or 40 ago, a cradle or a casket? And this gives you a historical image for a moment to think about. From 1650 to 1750, if you take these big blocks of time and ask the question, why should Johnny and Mary go to school? Well, obviously, if you were in a pilgrim family, it was because they needed to learn how to read the Bible because their eternal salvation was at stake. And then, in the wings, came the idea in 1770s about becoming a free nation. And that meant all the authority was going to be pushed to the populace and not to the king. And so you got to have somebody that's literate if you're going to participate in a so-called democratic republic operation. And so that became, by 1750 to 1850, that had flipped over. We'd kind of moved a little bit away from the eternal salvation concern. And now we were taking all these immigrants from all of these countries coming to the United States, and we were trying to get them to be patriot-oriented, and we wanted to have a free nation. We wanted the people to vote, and you know the history. We don't teach it anymore in the schools, but you know the history. 1850 to 1950, cultivating patriotism and citizenship. That was the main thrust of getting the kids to school. And then it was, they were moving off of the farm and into the urban centers. In 1860, roughly speaking, 90% of the people lived in a rural environment, and 10% of the people lived in an urban environment. By 1960, that had flip-flopped. 90% were now in the cities, urban settings, 10% in the rural settings. And so you can see that. But then about that time, this training for industry, the science influences, and we're living in a secular society now. We've kicked God out of the picture and out of the classroom, and the Supreme Court had said bye-bye to it, and no more prayers there. And so custodialism began to raise. We wanted to do more and more for everybody. Feed them breakfast, don't just teach them, and do all of the things that now we embrace. And it's now a custodial function. From 1980 to 2000, this caretaking philosophy, and you can read the paper I wrote in 1982, and it kind of says it maybe better than I can say it in 2 minutes here. But it's also created an environment along with other forces and influences for factionalism. And we've got groups that want this and groups that want that. And unity is falling through the cracks. And that's one of the real challenges to try to make anything go. And you're going to hear other presenters talk about the frustrations they're going to feel by trying to get something that they think would be really good and would be, but the factions immobilize it. So that's one part. And sort of now to how this actually took place. We had a privately controlled sectarian system from 1700 on to a public controlled secular system during that transition period. Now we got more of a government controlled political system. And the way it happened was we went from a neighborhood-centered, parent-directed, professionally assisted program. The group of ranchers up in Wyoming hired a school marm from St. Louis and brought her out here and told her, this is the way you're going to act, but we want you to teach our kids to be literate, and so on. And that was pretty important. Well, as it grew and evolved, we went to facilities. We didn't have just a little red schoolhouse with one room. We built another room, and then we kept expanding that. We had a board of education because the population increased, and the 10 ranchers were no longer able to administer all of these affairs, so they had representatives for them when they got into a town and a metropolis, and that's where that came from. And then the administrators and teachers came on the scene, and they had to go to school and get certified, and that cost money, and they thought they had more control and interest and influence. All these are legitimate concerns, and they're a part of the fabric. But what happened was we flipped the bottom. And now we've got neighborhood-centered schools because we went through the big consolidation movement. And so the little red schoolhouses closed down, and we put everybody in central school. If you counted up all the schools in the United States named central school, it would be a long, big number. That's how it came to be. And then it became professionally directed and parent-assisted, rather than parent-directed and professionally assisted. The parents now came to the PTA, and then they brought the punch and cookies, but the shots were being called by the professional cadre. And so that gets to be one of the big issues. And now we could go on into these areas, and you could see what happened with what the squabble is this week with what our president has just said about using administrative power. It's all over your TVs. There's a book written by a guy by the name of Paul Hamburger, 600 pages explaining or addressing the question, is administrative law legal? And that's what's going on right now in Washington, D.C. But that's the same thing as custodial education, only it's in a political environment. Who's going to take care of everybody? This is why context is important, and I'll quit here. You've seen this before. How did they build that ship in that bottle? Well, there's context, there's content, structure, and process in that little project. You have to have the stuff to make the structure. You have to put it together somehow. You've got to have a process of doing that remains a mystery to a lot of people. And then there's the content, the materials that you actually used. But it has to fit in the bottle. And you can't build that kind of a ship in these kinds of bottles. And that's what I mean when I say context determines or heavily influences content, process, and structure. So whenever we talk about content, process, and structure, from my point of view, you're leaving out the most important element if you don't get a foundation of context underneath of it. And the way to deal with conflicts in philosophies is to do something related to context and not just argue about content, process, and structure. I appreciate the opportunity of spending these minutes with you. I want you to know how positive and hopeful I am about what can be done. It just has to get people thinking with something that has a commonality in order to think about what to do with our children in our home, in our schools, in our communities, in our churches, wherever we're at. And I'm grateful to be here to express those feelings to you and do so. And thank you for the invitation, Hope.